SECfans.com doing another round of bowl shows for all of you, and we've got some interesting matchups this week. For those of you who watch the first video of ours and then are curious of what's going on, we're going to do a handful of SEC games that are pretty important, and then we're going to talk about the Rose Bowl, and we're going to touch on something that I think y'all might be interested in. It's a hypothetical of Alabama and Ohio State if they would have played. We're going to discuss that game sort of in theory. Not going to spend a whole lot of time on it, but I think it might be interesting for y'all. Okay, so starting out this kind of, I don't want to say week because we've got some time left before some of these games, but this week of bowls that we're going to discuss, we're going to kick it off with Auburn and Central Florida, and this is an interesting matchup. I think Auburn fans are kind of, if you talk to them, and I have, if you talk to them, they're a little crestfallen given the end of their season. Obviously, looking at a playoff berth potential if they can beat Georgia. Things didn't go their way in the SEC championship game. And then if you look at the name on paper of their opponent, it's Central Florida, where, you know, like LSU's got a Notre Dame, or, you know, Ohio State's playing USC. These traditional powerhouses like to play other traditional powerhouses, just even if they're not even that good. The name on paper always matters. But what's interesting in this game is that Central Florida is not necessarily that name on paper, but all season they've kind of been that beast in, obviously, the win-loss column, and they're one of these teams that had a little bit of rumbling about maybe backdooring into the playoffs. So they're a legitimate threat regardless of how you look at it. And I'm curious, Josh, what you think about this matchup in terms of the mentality of Auburn sort of, I don't know, backing into the bowl season, given how their last game went relative to expectations, versus Central Florida. Does this give Central Florida an advantage because they're not that name on paper that they can, you know, jump all over Auburn because they're sky high, and maybe Auburn's not, and maybe Central Florida is just good enough to jump all over Auburn? What do you think?
One has to think it is an advantage, at least on some level, for the lesser known team to be in this position. Historically, there's been a number of examples where teams like Houston or Louisville or Boise State has gone into these games, Utah, and really been able to make a name for themselves. And a lot of times the rhetoric that sort of surrounds these games is this idea that, well, the big name team just didn't come in really caring and they didn't want to play. I think that may be true to a certain extent. I think there have been a number of those times where the big name team doesn't really prepare as heavily. It used to be these bowl games were kind of a vacation for the players. A lot of times northern teams complain because so many of these bowl games are played in southern states. Well, the reason for that is it's actually a pretty modern thing where these games are given real meaningful weight. The idea of a championship is fairly new. Usually the champion was crowned just based purely on polling. That really, remember, only changed about 20 years ago with the institution of the BCS. Before then, number one versus number two games were extremely rare. The BCS was important not only because it slotted the championship, but it also slotted the other bowls, and we started to get much more competitive matchups on a consistent basis. Now we see these bowl games as a more competitive telling thing. We see it as an evaluation of the quality of your team and often impugn to the quality of the conference. We can probably get into that later and how maybe that's probably a bit of a mistake for a variety of reasons. But I do think when you have a team like Auburn that really had a lot of potential to do something in the postseason in terms of the playoffs, that missed out on that due to just one bad game, really, after having a couple extremely good games. And it's easy to say that because they blew out the team that ended up blowing them out in the championship game. I think it's really feasible to say that Auburn isn't going to be as motivated in this ball game. I don't think it's a rude thing to say. Auburn has nothing really to gain from winning this game. They're probably not thrilled about it. You've got a lot of kids that are on December break. And the reality is, how much extra time do you want to spend in the film room studying up for UCF? How much extra time do you want to spend preparing for this game? And for UCF, this is a chance to prove themselves. And for a lot of these kids, this is going to be far and away the biggest, most important game probably of their college careers. They're going to spend every waking moment they can preparing for this game. Practice time is pretty limited. The amount of time that a coach can require a player to prepare is rather limited. The times that a team does really well is when they have the game quote unquote circled, because those guys will spend an extra couple hours a day in the film room prepping, and they're just going to go hard every day in practice. It does matter. All that said, I think a lot of times too much is taken away from the teams end up in these games, and a little bit of it, to me, I think you can draw a parallel to the 5-star or 3-star dichotomy. A lot of times people will want to say stars don't matter. Stars absolutely matter. A 5-star player has, I want to say it's a better than 1 in 4 chance of making the NFL, more than 25%. I think it's something like 30 to 40% of 5-star players make the NFL. That's an extremely high rate. If you were to look at 3-star players, the rate of them that makes the NFL, I think it's less than 1%. But there are way more 3-star players. And when I say way more, I mean there's about 50 to 1 3-star players to 5-star players. And when the numbers are that skewed, then there's going to be probably as many or more 3-star guys than there are 5-star guys. And again, if I'm saying there's a 30% chance a 5-star makes it and 1% chance a 3-star makes it, but there's 53 stars to every 5-star, you end up with more 3-stars in the NFL than you do 5-stars. Why does this all have to do with the Auburn and UCF? Well, because when you have teams that are made up of 3-stars like UCF and teams that are made up of 5-stars like Auburn, it's easy to look at this and go, oh, well, it's just UCF. They're not going to be as talented, blah, 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 blah. But the problem is there's a lot of teams with talent like UCF's, but only one of those teams actually got to this point. And the fact that UCF is the one that gets here, it's sort of a self-selection. And you can't completely discount UCF because it may well prove that UCF has a tremendous amount of talent. It could be that UCF is the statistical aberration, if you will, in terms of NFL talent or quality of talent or whatever for every team that recruited like they did through a period of time. And so you essentially have the best 5, and Auburn wasn't even really, because of where they ended up, let's say the 5th best 5-star school, and we'll say 5th of 15 of the teams that really recruit at an elite level. You got what is an average team for teams that recruit at an elite level to compare to the other 115 schools. This is the one out of those other 115 that had the most luck with everything panning out. And a lot of time I think that gets discounted. It really got discounted way back when with Boise State. It's important to remember that Boise State those years, they've got 2 of those receivers ended up being, I think, first-round draft picks and longtime NFL starters. Everybody loved Kellen Moore, the quarterback. My thoughts then that I still hold was that this running back they had named Doug Martin, no one could really stop. I was very vocal at that time when I was doing a little blog thing that I always felt like Kellen Moore got way too much credit for the fact that no one could stop their run game because they had so many linemen. A lot of teams struggled with the speed at the receiving core. They struggled with some guys. They had several guys drafted in the NFL out of the defense that year. And what I'm getting at is sometimes when you look at a school like UCF and you say they're not going to have that much talent. Okay, if you were looking at them before the season, the odds of it are low. But when you get to the end of the season and they're the team that has blown everybody out all year and they're the team that ends undefeated, then you have to accept that you're playing the exception. And a lot of times I think people just don't give that enough credit and they underestimate how good these teams really are. And quite frankly, UCF in theory shouldn't be as talented, but you know what? They may very well be, just because if you've got 115 teams, the odds are one of those 115 teams is probably going to be a lot more talented than they should be.
Okay, so I think this is an interesting comparison because last year we were looking at a Houston team that was really close to getting into the playoffs. And we've seen this from a number of teams that aren't your normal Power 5 programs where they generate a lot of heat probably 3/4 of the way through the season because they're 9-0, 10-0, whatever, and then they stumble, down the stretch. So what does it say about a team that may not have that much recruiting talent, but can be one of the few that actually does run the table at a high level versus one of these that gets the hype but finishes 10-2 or 11-1?
I think it says a lot about what they were able to do to finish the season, but I also think you have to keep schedules sort of in the back of your mind. Now, Houston in 2016 got a tremendous amount of credit for beating Oklahoma in week 1. Oklahoma last year was a good team. They were in many ways a flawed team. And they only dropped 2 games in 2016. They dropped one against Ohio State. They did better throughout the rest of the year. But there were a lot of signs that maybe the Big 12 wasn't as good. They played Auburn in the bowl game. We're already getting a ton of heat for Oklahoma fans on our Oklahoma Georgia prediction because we're giving Georgia any credit. I think a lot of Oklahoma fans ignore that Auburn without Sean White at the end of the year had been completely impotent offensively. So I think they got a lot of credit for that. And I'm just saying that in terms of Houston throughout much of the year. I mean, it wasn't just like they failed into the stretch, right? I mean, they lose to Navy, they lose to SMU, they lose to Memphis. They played 2 ranked games. They beat those 2 ranked teams, and then they end the season getting beaten quite badly by San Diego State in a bowl game. Central Florida is not Houston. They have played at a high level all year. Now, they haven't played ranked games. Not really. I mean, you've got Memphis on the schedule, but I mean, they haven't played Power 5 ranked games. They don't have a win over Oklahoma on their resume this year, but they've taken care of business in a way that I think certainly Houston didn't last year. And you got to give them credit for that. The problem with it is with Georgia Tech being canceled and even Georgia Tech, let's keep in mind, isn't an excellent team this year. Their schedule was quite weak. And if you want to compare where they're at versus a lot of other teams, like if you want to compare Houston in 2016 with UCF this year and sort of the overall strength of schedule, UCF only played 3 games against teams in the top 60 this year. Those games were South Florida and Memphis twice. Okay, so only 2 different teams. One of them they played twice. And then you go through Houston. Houston played 6 different teams. Oklahoma, Navy, Tulsa, Louisville, Memphis, San Diego State, all in the top 60. Houston's schedule was harder, and it was harder repeatedly. When UCF played a schedule that essentially gave them, in my opinion, if you're going to be anything resembling a ranked team, you should not lose to a team outside the top 60. If you want to have a playoff conversation, you cannot lose to a team outside the top 60. And this is kind of, I think you actually can make the argument outside the top 40, which is why Ohio State got dinged the way they did. UCF only had 3 games that fall in the category of what should be a losable game to a playoff team. Those games, the first one against Memphis, they blew Memphis out. But the last 2, South Florida and Memphis, were both 1-score games. And if you looked at, say, Football Outsider statistics, so this is a lot of the statistics run by Bill Connolly, they do an adjusted scoring margin. So they say what was your win expectancy based off the statistics and where you're at, field position. UCF should have lost the South Florida game. They had about a 35% win expectancy in that game, even though they won by 7. My point here is I think you have to be a little careful talking about how much UCF survived and made it through the stretch because it was actually not very difficult for them to do so. They had 3 games they could lose. One of those 3, the first game against Memphis, they won in commanding fashion. The other 2, really, they averaged a 50% win chance in those 2, and they frankly just got lucky. So I think you have to give them credit for pulling that off. But again, comparing like in the Houston comparison, they just didn't have as many losable games. And again, I talk about top 60 teams, but when you move outside of that, most of their games were against teams that were 80th or worse. Let me see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, with a 7th against number 78 Navy. So when the majority of your season's that bad, I mean, it's easy to be consistent because you just, even if you slip up once, you're only going to end up with one loss. And it gave UCF a pretty darn easy track to be here. Now, they were at times dominant in those games, but I think you also have to acknowledge how small the sample size is of games that UCF could have lost.
But one thing we like to talk about, and Auburn fans, we're going to get to you in a minute, I promise. But I'm kind of fascinated with this year's UCF team. One thing we like to talk about in terms of elite teams is you can't help who's on your schedule, but you can help how you play against them. And for the most part, you kind of touched on this. For the most part, Central Florida not only went 12-0, but they beat the brakes off of everybody they played. And that's not something we see a lot of times from these non-Power 5, non-major teams when they're coming in the postseason kind of with a clean record. A lot of times it's, hey, they're 11-1 or even 12-0, but they struggled against these 6 teams and they just got the clean record. So you got to give them credit in that respect.
I think you do, but again, we're obviously pretty honest on the show, and I try to be as straightforward as I can. I give them credit for beating up on a lot of teams, but I think you have to understand how bad those teams are. If you were to look to their one-score wins, right? When did they win by one score? They won by one score against South Florida, who's 15th in S&P, Memphis 18th. They won by one score against SMU, who's 60th. If you look at teams that were better than 80th overall, the only team they beat by more than one score was that first game against Memphis. And even Navy, who's sitting right at 80, they only beat by 10. All those blowouts were consistently against the worst teams on their schedule. And those teams were generally so bad that those teams also almost always lost by those kinds of margins anytime they played a team that was really good. Now, I don't know that the results are necessarily out of whack because, again, South Florida is 15th in S&P. Memphis is 18th. Those are good teams. They're not necessarily elite teams, but they were within a score of those teams. And UCF was climbing up second or third in S&P, and late in the year, it started falling down to 10th or below. And the reason for that is, yes, they blew out most of the teams in their schedule. Yes, we give credit for beating bad teams, but they weren't just bad teams. They were terrible teams. And when they did play better teams, their scoring margin consistently got smaller, as one would expect for a team that wasn't that much better than some of their competition. And that was against teams like South Florida and Memphis. It still wasn't against Power 5 teams. So, I mean, if you were to plot that curve out and you're projecting them against a top 5 team, well, if you're within a score of a team between 15th and 20th nationally, then it's hard to say that you're going to be favored against a team in the top 10.
You see, Central Florida fans, this is what happens, and this is why we call him the Grim Reaper. I've been trying to drag him into some positivity on Central Florida, and doesn't look like we're going to get it today. That's all right. So when we talk about this game, we're going to get to a computer model in a second, but I want to talk about some matchups first. One thing I think we've seen with Central Florida, and there's a little bit of that Oklahoma versus Georgia, Big 12 might have bad defenses, which makes the offenses look better sort of thing. What we've seen with Central Florida this year is a lot of points, a whole lot of points, and a very interesting, fun to watch, dynamic kind of offense that Auburn doesn't really see in the SEC. I think you could say Missouri, when they're good offensively, they've never been good defensively. Missouri, when they're good offensively, and maybe Ole Miss, when they're good offensively, employs some kind of characteristics of this offense. So when we're talking about Auburn and what they've seen this year in the SEC and what they're comfortable with, is that an opportunity and a space that Central Florida might be able to have some success? I'm giving you one more shot to be positive for Central Florida, but you don't have to be. We're, like you said, we're honest here. So take it and run with it.
I think it is important, and you joke about me being the Grim Reaper. I answer the question you asked me, and I don't think it's all negative for UCF, and we're going to see that when we get to the model. And the reason UCF has a more than fighting chance in this game is their offense, and I think probably a lot of Auburn fans are going to seriously underestimate how good their offense is. Again, we look back at the S&P rankings. Why does S&P think that we're this good? Why does S&P think they went undefeated? Well, the reason is that they were listed as the number 2 team offensively in the country. The problem is they're listed 78th defensively. But Auburn really hasn't faced offenses with this kind of firepower, and it can be difficult, as a lot of teams that have played Auburn in recent years know, to face a team that has this kind of just this kind of offensive potency. And if you're looking at you know what are comparable teams, or who else have they played, and you say, well, we've played some really good offenses, and this isn't going to be so much of a shock. I'm going to kind of counter that a little bit, because Central Florida is kind of in a different class. I mean, you mentioned Missouri and Ole Miss. Ole Miss is probably the closest, and Ole Miss is 11th nationally in S&P offensive rankings. And if you want to fall down from there, it's Georgia and Alabama sitting around 18th and 19th. Now Auburn had a lot of success against those teams, particularly Alabama and Georgia, but they still scored points. And Georgia put up 28 in the last game. Mississippi put up 23 early in the year. And I will say Ole Miss really climbed in this rankings when they replaced their quarterback. It's almost like some shows spent a lot of time early in the season talking about how we didn't really feel like Shea Patterson was all that great. Maybe we'll have to point that out when we get to the Michigan preview. But yeah, I mean, Auburn hasn't faced an offense of this caliber. Now, my concern with UCF is totally based off the fact that when they played better teams, they had to outpace them because their defense struggled so much. But if Auburn fans feel like they're going to go into this game and win 50-0, I don't think it's realistic, because Central Florida's offense is excellent. And I think a lot of times when you have these games with a small team playing a big team, one of the things that happens is, the Auburns, or, Auburn can come out and be a little rusty. They're a little slow. They haven't played in a while. And all of a sudden, Central Florida comes out. They're geared up for this game, and they come out of the gate scoring. And by the time Auburn blinks, they're down 21-0. That's happened a bunch in games like this. And Auburn fans don't need to be surprised if they have a hard time slowing Central Florida. It's nothing against your team. Central Florida is that good offensively. They really are. And you have to give them a lot of credit for it. And I think it's going to be something that causes Auburn some problems.
Okay, so on the flip side, you mentioned that Central Florida is not great defensively, and there's two things I'd like for you to address here. One, last week, I think it was Central Florida running back came out and said that Auburn's not ready, hasn't seen the kind of speed that they've shown on offense. They haven't seen anything like that in the SEC. I'd like for you to speak to that a little bit. And he also said that they're not ready for a swarming defense. And I find it a little ridiculous. And I think trash talk is kind of fun. I don't think even players read too much into that. So I think a lot is being made of these comments. But does that also maybe speak to the mentality of a team that hasn't played a real Power 5? I know they played Maryland, like a real Power 5 team that's playing, like an Auburn team that's playing week in and week out against 5-star talent. Does it speak to their maybe being overconfident, and how does that play into Auburn's matching up against their defense, given at least the rankings we've seen statistically for Central Florida on their defense?
Well, I think first it does say a lot about maybe where the players are at. Now, players get cocky a lot. And the thing that was kind of the theme early in the season was the Vanderbilt lineman that decided to call out Alabama, and that didn't go well for them. And as we talked about at the time, Vanderbilt really hadn't played anybody that could run the ball at all. And we kind of flagged that game as a serious red flag of, we don't know that Vanderbilt is what they're claiming to be and what they're being hyped to be. And sure enough, it really wasn't that Alabama was so great even. It's that Vanderbilt was just not that good. And the truth of the matter is, college football, for all the talk of parity, there is a really big divide between the good teams and the bad. And even though Central Florida has played some pretty good teams in South Florida and Memphis, they're not the same caliber of the sorts of teams that Auburn's played week in and week out. And they may be, in terms of winning a game, as good or better, but in terms of the overall talent level and the speed at linebacker and corner and safety, and particularly it's really the speed in the front seven always. the pass rushers, the defensive tackles, and the linebackers. No, I mean, Central Florida probably hasn't seen the sort of speed that Auburn's going to bring to the table. But more importantly, I think if your players don't understand that, look, most of the teams Auburn played were more talented than any team Central Florida played. Can create a problem because the Central Florida players get in their head about an idea of how fast the game flows, and you sort of get used to the fact that your team is a very fast team and can overwhelm teams and swarm the ball, et cetera, et cetera. And I think this is kind of where I'm differentiating from some teams like, again, Houston last year. Houston had a couple games against really elite talent level teams, was able to sort of hold their own or at least get some experience. And if you go back and look at some of the others, like the examples like Louisville or Boise State, usually those players had all played games against really big teams and they'd won some of them. Boise's case, they'd won a lot of them. And that let the players know, hey, this is what it's like to play that kind of athlete. But you also didn't hear the arrogance for Boise players to feel like they were more athletic than what the other team had ever seen. They understood they were going to have to play hard nosed football. If Central Florida comes out and thinks they're going to just do shock and awe and that Auburn isn't going to be used to the athleticism that Central Florida is going to present, I think they're going to have a bit of a rude awakening because while their offense is very good and they are pretty fast, particularly offensively, defensively, they're not going to be above average. And, they're going to be below average in a lot of ways. And some of the guys can move around a lot. And, the secondary players can be pretty quick. But Auburn's played a lot of future NFL talent, and they've played a number of first round draft pick NFL players. Nothing about Central Florida is going to surprise Auburn. So I do think that's, it's kind of a weird thing to say, and you don't know if it's just one player running his mouth, but it's a little bit of motivation, and it's certainly not the attitude you want to have going into this game.
And what about Auburn? So we talked about Central Florida and how offensively they could pose some problems for Auburn's defense. What about how Auburn matches up in a game against? I don't think any Central Florida fan can reasonably say that they have a good defense. I really don't. So even if you have an elite offense, and let's say Central Florida's offense is elite, what kind of pressure does that put on the offense? Since, in your opinion, I think you're probably going to say we know that Auburn's going to score. So let's talk, instead of saying, hey, how does their defense match up against Auburn's offense? We've seen Auburn score on good defenses, so we know they're going to score on a bad defense. What kind of pressure does it put on that elite Central Florida offense, if any, given that they know they're going to give up points?
Well, I think it puts a considerable amount of pressure, obviously. And we talk about this a lot. We talked about it a lot with the Oklahoma-Georgia game, that Georgia's offense could have some issues because Oklahoma is going to put pressure on Georgia because Georgia has the ability to score. And I think you're right that one of the keys to this game is going to be, can Central Florida stop Auburn? And if they can't stop Auburn from scoring, it's going to be tough. Auburn's offense, when it has been clicking, has been extremely effective. And it's very, very difficult to beat a team that can score consistently just running the football. We talk about this a lot. Anytime a team starts getting 6, 7, 8 yards per carry and can do it consistently, you tend to see those just runaway blowout games real quickly. It's what Georgia did repeatedly in the SEC. It's what Auburn has done about 5 or 6 times a year for the past few years. It's just hard to win in those situations. And the reason, like you said, is pressure. And it's especially bad because if the other team can run the ball that successfully, you can wait for a drop pass or an incompletion, but it's really hard to wait for the other team's tailback to trip on his own feet 3 times in a row. And if he's running for a first down every other play, they're pretty much just going to keep going to the end zone. And you've got to start to get really desperate defensively to stop them. And you pile that on top of the fact that you start getting battered in the time of possession battle, it really starts adding up. They've consistently sustaining drives, which means they have a really high number of plays. Your offense starts getting a little desperate. They start taking shots because they feel like they have to score. Those are usually lower probability. It doesn't pay off in the end, and everything starts to sort of slide back on you. And I think you got to give a lot of credit to what Frost has been able to do. And I don't know that we necessarily want to go the ballpark of what does it mean that he's going to be leaving the program, et cetera, et cetera. That's a whole other level of discussion. But yeah, I think that pressure is going to be tough. And anytime we look at one of these matchups and we see, okay, we've got an offense here. In this case, it's really Auburn's going against a defense that may not be good enough to really stop them ever. Uh, it, it it's really hard to finagle your way into saying who's going to win. That said, the model still has a lot of love for UCF, and I think if we want to talk about matchups, that's probably the next place to go to discuss how these two really match up in that regard.
Yeah, I think I think now's as good a time as any. I mean, we could talk about matchups. A lot of this is still in theory because they're so different. Not necessarily in terms of styles or whatever, because Auburn has an up-tempo, fast-paced offense. But when you have so few cross-pollinated data points to go from, and the conferences are so different that they play in, sometimes these games come out really weird in the model. So I'm interested to see what the model says. So why don't you go ahead and let us know?
Sure. So for those that don't know, and it's probably going to be mainly UCF fans because we've done a number of Auburn games. The model looks at per play statistics. We don't use total yardage because we're trying to control for tempo and for number of plays run as much as possible. And we look at how you did versus how your opponents normally allow other teams to do. So everything is a comparative statistic based off the strength of your opponents. And one of the main statistics we always discuss is percentage of how much of opponent averages you allow. So if the other teams you've played average 4.5 yards per carry and you allow 3.9, what is that as a percentage of your opponent averages? In this case, Auburn's opponents average about a half yard per play better than UCF's. So it actually exaggerates the difference in the defenses. Auburn's defense averaging 3.6 yards per carry allowed, and UCF's 4.5. That sounds like a pretty big gap, but it's actually bigger than that because, again, Auburn's play better rush defenses. Auburn's only allowing 73% of opponent rushing averages, but UCF is allowing 96.5. We talk about it a lot. Anything more than 95% is average. And this is also where we have a huge asterisk because connectivity is a big deal. Bill Connolly's been discussing a lot with his S&P rankings as a big warning that this year there is a lot less connectivity, meaning teams in one conference have not played another conference very much. This has been really bad in the really good group of 5 teams because, for example, UCF not playing Georgia Tech, there's less connectivity there. We don't really have a good data point to normalize things, if you will. In his analysis, he's been noting that S&P, when a group of 5 team plays a Power 5 team, his S&P has been over exaggerating the strength of the Power 5 team by about 7 to 9 points per game. In other words, the average scoring margin in those games, the Power 5 teams do about 7 to 10 points better than they're projected on average. And so here, even though we're saying UCF has 96.5% of opponent rush averages, Auburn allows 73% of SEC rushing averages, more or less. UCF is allowing 96.5% of Power 5 rush averages. Group of 5 rush averages, not Power 5 rush averages. UCF is allowing essentially the teams that they play to do the average of what they would do. And you have to remember those teams are inferior to the teams Auburn has played. So the statistic is less meaningful. Same thing with pass. Auburn allowing 75% of SEC passing averages. UCF, they're only allowing 92% of their opponent pass averages. But again, we're talking about group of 5 teams, not Power 5 teams. Now, when we run all that by and try to make predictions, it does predict Auburn to outgain UCF about 6 yards per play to 5.9. The biggest advantage here, both teams are expected to have the same passing average, but Auburn is expected to average almost 5 yards a carry, and UCF should be held under 4 yards per carry. Really, they're probably going to be their worst rushing output of the season, which is not surprising because Auburn is not even remotely the best rushing defense they'll face. Where it gets screwy, as you noted, is the projection. Our model projects UCF to beat Auburn 43-27. And I'm going to have to explain that. the model uses historical data to come up with its scoring production. It says, okay, this with this kind of offensive output, how does that map to your scoring production? The problem is UCF's floor is really high. Their lowest scoring game of the season was 31 points. Okay. And if you looked at 5.9 yards per play, what's the closest game? Well, that was Temple at 45 points scored in that game. Other than that, UCF has not been held under 6 yards per play the entire year. So our model, which is tries to predict on a slope, and it's usually pretty good at predicting where you're going to be when you're on an extreme. Where it really struggles is where you have a team that is one either extremely unpredictable, in which case the model somewhat rightly will say, we don't really know how much this team's going to score, or if you have a team like this that has never really been challenged and their offense has been dominant. So it's projecting where it's projecting because it says, okay, well, it's about the same production we got against Temple, but the games like that were, runaway games and you have a lot of, garbage time and other stuff. The truth of the matter is we really don't know what UCF scoring looks like. What I think is notable is that Auburn is only expected to score 27 points off their production at about 6 yards per play. However, the thing I'll caution there is if you were to look at the two most similar games or, some of the more similar games here, probably the closest was that Auburn had 6.28 yards per carry against Texas A&M. They scored 42 points in that ball game. So I think the model is actually being very conservative with Auburn scoring. In large part, it's because the past few games when they've been playing Alabama, and including the Alabama game and the Georgia game, without Kerryon Johnson, they really struggled, and that sort of anchored the model. And they had periods early in the year where the running backs were banged up and they weren't functioning well. That's kind of anchored the model. And when I say anchored it, I mean when they've had it's anchoring what our model thinks like scoring will look like when they're held to a reasonably low amount of yards. But when Auburn has been healthy, they have greatly exceeded our statistical predictions. It's the same reason we felt like Georgia would probably beat Auburn based off our model because, as we noted, when they've had basically our model's taking the season average, but you have two versions of Auburn. Auburn with healthy running backs is going to greatly exceed their season average. Auburn with unhealthy running backs will greatly hit under. The model right now is saying their sort of average production is 27 points, but that's almost slanting more towards the running backs being injured because they've really honestly been injured more than they've been healthy this year in challenging games. So I think a more realistic score, it says 43-27. I'm going to say a more realistic score is probably going to be something like 42-42. And that's just looking straightly on the model and the data. And I think you go from there. A very high scoring game on both sides. And I think it's more a matter of who's going to outscore whom here.
And you say 42-42. You're not saying that's your gut prediction. You're saying if the model were doing more of an apples to apples comparison with schedules and conferences and that sort of thing, you'd say that it would probably come up with something like that.
Right. I think it's really the defensive rankings for UCF are overinflated because of their opponents. And Auburn's offensive rankings in this model are deflated because there are a number of games where they were really, really banged up that are dragging down the model prediction.
All right, so why don't you go ahead and give us your gut score on what you think that this game will end up as, even though I think I know the direction you're going to go. And for people who don't see our show a lot, we don't really tend to deviate that much from the model. So I'm curious to see if you're going to here.
A lot of it depends on health. The most recent news is Johnson may be pretty healthy. I think even if Johnson's not healthy, at least Cam Martin should be over a sprained ankle, which I think was just as bad in that Georgia game because they had no depth. If those guys are healthy, I think it's going to be a flippant track meet. And I just think when push comes to shove, Auburn has some guys, particularly on that front, that can create a couple stops. And I'm going to go super high here, judging by the speed of offenses. I'm going to say Auburn 56, UCF 41.
Wow. That's a lot. I have a hard time. So I think we've seen Auburn score in the 50s this year and last year with a healthy Shaun White. And one of the sort of common threads in that was that they beat somebody 53-6, 53-3, like Arkansas last year, Ole Miss this year, where the opponent didn't really do anything, which gave Auburn a lot of possessions, and Auburn has a tendency to jump on somebody real early. So if Auburn scores in the 50s, which I don't think they will, but if they do score in the 50s, I don't think that it's 50s and 40s. I think it's like 50s and teens. But I don't think that's going to happen. So in my gut, I think Auburn's going to win. I think they're going to win pretty big. And I think not necessarily the overall speed of Auburn is going to give Central Florida fits. I think Central Florida's got a ton of athletes. I think they've got some good team speed. I do think what's going to be a little shocking to them is the speed of Auburn's defensive line and really Auburn's front seven. So give me 42 for Auburn and 24 for Central Florida. And I know Central Florida fans aren't going to love these scores that we're given. They're going to call us SEC homers. But look, if Central Florida wins this game, we're going to own it like we always do. I mean, when we're wrong, we own it. When we're right, we try not to rub it in everybody's face, but we still do that a little bit anyway. But this is a really interesting matchup, and I hope Auburn fans are excited about this matchup and don't just look at the name on paper, because if their team is doing that, they're going to get beat. But I think that... man, I love seeing just how well a 12-0 team that doesn't have a tough schedule, that wanted to say they deserved a shot at the playoffs, stacks up against a team like Auburn that was on the outside looking into the playoffs, but not that far outside looking in on the playoffs. So it's an opportunity for an SEC team to kind of shut that noise down, and it's an opportunity for a team like in the past that Boise did to show that, hey, we're here, we belong, don't dismiss our 12-0 record, and look at what we can do.